peculiar and dramatic forms of acting, writing, and speaking are exempt from any problems of duplicity. Here again is another point that we need, a point of clarification, in asking ourselves the question, how far do we go with this prohibition of all untruthfulness? Well, of course, the answer would be we go as far as God's Word goes. And God's Word does not go so far as making this third point that I've just put up here not really a point. So now if you'll open your Bibles back up to 1 Kings 20. Now, last week, I think in the first teaching, we looked at this. 1 Kings chapter 20, verses 35 through 43. Now, I hope that we are clearing away some of the rubbish in your mind and you're able to focus more and more on what the issue is so that you don't answer these questions wrong anymore. Most people in the world in the church just don't think too much about lying except the black, white, black business. That's wrong. And so many people in the world, as well as in the church, would say, well, that's wrong only when that appears in an important situation or context. In other words, it's all right to lie so that you don't have to hurt the hostess' feelings or something like that. As long as it's a small lie, a white lie, well, that's really not bad. There's nothing wrong with that. Well, of course, there is something wrong with that. That is a moral evil. But then some people then, when they get into truthfulness, they say, all right, and then they just start ruling everything out. And you know what we did last week. We talked about fishing and hunting and playing games and all of this, and if you're going to adopt the 100% anti, and we're 100% anti-lies, but I mean the hyper view of that, and if you're going to be faithful to that, then you see what the conclusion is. You could never go fishing, you could never do anything that even resembles in any form the practice of deceit. And see, I think that's going too far then. And it's not just my thought, the Bible clearly proves that's going too far. And one of the best examples is right here in 1 Kings 20. Now, as far as action is concerned, what's he pretending? He's pretending as though he's somehow been wounded in battle, or he at least has gone through the heat of a battle. And that's not true. And what does he say? Well, that he's been in a battle, and a captive was given to him. He had to watch it, and it escaped. Well, did that ever happen? Well, that never did happen. This is your sentence, the king of Israel said. You have pronounced it yourself, that either you'll have to die your life for his life or pay a talent of silver. Then the prophet quickly removed the headband from his eyes. The king of Israel recognized him as one of the prophets. He said to the king, "This is what the Lord says. You have set free a man I had determined should die. Therefore it is your life for his life." And we'll see it just 2 chapters later, this prophecy fulfilled. This isn't one of those we have to wait until the latter days to see if it ever happens, or to see when it happens, because this takes place 2 chapters later. It's your life for his life, your people for his people. Sullen and angry, the king of Israel, Ahab, went to his palace in Samaria. In 1 Kings 20, 35 through 43, we have a case of disguise used by a prophet of the Lord. And so, of course, we put this under certain peculiar and dramatic forms of action. Now, there is another text, where is that? In 2 Samuel. Turn with me to, I believe it's in 2 Samuel chapter 14. Let's give ourselves 2 good cases of this. Yeah, 2 Samuel chapter 14. Now, 1 Kings 20, 2 Samuel 14 go together under A, and of course they also fit under B because talking is required. Speaking is required. You ever read this story and wondered whether what was done was right or not? Joab, son of Zeruiah, knew that the king's heart longed for Absalom. Now, Absalom has finally been allowed to come back, but he has to dwell in his own house, and he's not allowed to see the face of the king, his father, David. And Joab knows that Absalom wants to see the king, and Joab knows it would probably, or he thinks, I should say, that it would probably just be good in general for Israel if this family faction was dissolved between the king and his son. So Joab sent someone to Tekoa and had a wise woman brought from there. And he said to her, "Pretend you are in mourning, dress in mourning clothes, and don't use any cosmetic lotions. Act like a woman who has spent many days grieving for the dead. Then go to the king and speak these words to him." And Joab put the words in her mouth. When the woman from Tekoa went to the king, and we'll find out what Joab put in her mouth as we read the narrative, she fell with her face to the ground to pay him honor, and she said, "Help me, O king." The king said, "What's troubling you?" She said, "I am indeed a widow. My husband is dead. I, your servant, had 2 sons. They got into a fight with each other in the field, and no one was there to separate them. One struck the other and killed him, and now the whole clan has risen up against your servant. They say, 'Hand over the one who struck his brother down, so that we may put him to death for the life of his brother whom he killed. Then we'll get rid of the heir as well.' They would put out the only burning coal I have left, because she has no husband and no children now except this one, and that would mean no children, leaving my husband neither name nor descendant on the face of the earth." The king said to the woman, "Go home, and I will issue an order in your behalf." But the woman of Tekoa said to him, "My lord the king, let the blame rest on me." Here's her humility and piety, gracing the king so that she will be allowed to continue to speak. "And on my father's family, and let the king and his throne be without guilt." The king replied, "If anyone says anything to you, bring him to me. He will not bother you again." She said, "Let the king invoke the Lord his God to prevent the avenger of death from adding to the destruction, so that my son will not be destroyed." Well, he's just going around in circles with this lady because she's wanting to get to her point. "As surely as the Lord lives," he said, "not one hair of your son's head will fall to the ground." Then the woman said, "Let your servant speak a word to my lord the king." "Speak," he replied. And here's what she wants to get to. "Why then have you devised a thing like this against the people of God?" Remember the case of Amnon and Absalom, that Absalom has killed his brother because he raped his half-sister, which was Absalom's full sister. And so you have 2 brothers here again, one that's being killed, and now for all practical purposes, Absalom is having to live as a dead man because the king will not recognize him officially or publicly. So it means both of the sons are dead. And of course her point, Joab making through her, is that doesn't make any sense. You've already lost one son. Why not receive the son that you have left back into your good graces? Of course the king does follow the advice of Joab, and it's to his own regret, of course, that he does. When the king says this, does he not convict himself? For the king has not brought back his banished son. Like water spilled on the ground which cannot be recovered, so he must die. But God does not take away life. Instead, he devises ways so that a banished person may not remain estranged from him. And now I've come to say this to my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid. Your servant thought, I will speak to the king, perhaps he will do what his servant asks. Perhaps the king will agree to deliver his servant from the hand of the man who is trying to cut off both me and my son from the inheritance. God save us. And now your servant says, may the word of my lord the king bring me rest, for my lord the king is like an angel of God. In discerning good and evil, may the Lord your God be with you. And the king says, now I have a question for you, and don't hide the answer. And she said, speak. And he said, 19, is not the hand of Joab with you in all this? At least David knew Joab well enough to know when he saw that man. The woman answered, as surely as you live, you're as wise as an angel of God, down in verse 20, and Joab is in it. And the king says, call Joab in, and then he says, of course, Joab, now you call Absalom in, and then what's 15 called? Absalom's conspiracy. Well, was what Joab did there, was that wrong? Well, no. He was acting out almost in parable form to get the attention of the king. By the end, of course, never intending to imply that all of this story and this woman pretending like she is a widow and without one son, and now the other one, his life is in danger, and so she's been mourning many days without pretending any of that really ever took place. I mean, it starts off pretending that took place. But The king certainly realizes by the end, well, none of that really happened. You just used that to get through to me. Now, see, if I wouldn't have told you this, because some of you thought 1 Kings 20 was wrong, then you would fault Joab right here and say this is a lie. This is a whole pretentious act through which they go to get the king's attention. But we fit it under 3A as well as B, a certain peculiar and dramatic form of acting and speaking. Such drastic action as 1 Kings 20 and 2 Samuel 14, such drastic action was to visually and thus more powerfully illustrate a point. However, both of these people disguise themselves, remember? So here's something I have to add in. However, if statistics alone mean anything, it is interesting to note, it is interesting to see the general negative outcome of the 4 other biblical cases of disguise. Now, let's take the time to look at these. 1 Kings chapter 14, starting with verse 1. You see, because if we don't say this, then we could just argue from 1 Kings 20 and 2 Samuel 14 that disguise is allowed of God. And see, we've already denied that disguise is not allowed of God. Not when one is trying to flee one's enemies in persecution or some similar situation. Disguise is not allowed. Remember, the rule is you are allowed to capitalize on someone else's lack of reconnaissance in warfare, and their lack of preparation, their lack of misunderstanding, their lack of diligence and looking into the well for you. You're allowed to capitalize on that, but not create it. If they think that you're going to be beaten and defeated and they want to bring everybody out of the city after you, fine. Don't tell them how many men you've got on the other side of the hill over there. Fine. You can capitalize on that. You can't create it by going up and feigning a retreat as though they are superior in warfare or numbers than to you. So we want to look at these other cases of disguise because, as I say here, if statistics alone mean anything, when disguise is used, besides one of these dramatic forms of action which are clearly allowed of God, when disguise is used, it's always used in a negative context, which would make me believe and think that disguise would be wrong. Now here Jeroboam has a son who is at the door of death, whose name is Abijah, and the prophet's name is Ahijah, to whom Jeroboam sends his wife. But he sends his wife in disguise. That time Abijah, son of Jeroboam, became ill, and Jeroboam said to his wife, "Go disguise yourself, so you won't be recognized as the wife of Jeroboam." Now Jeroboam's a wicked king, and his wife is equally wicked. And so this isn't dramatic action where we're trying to prove a point, and we'll see at the end of the story none of this is really true. She wants to go and disguise herself and remain disguised, lest the prophet rake her husband, or his policies in the kingdom over the coals. But of course God's going to reveal to this prophet anyway who this woman is, even though the prophet is blind or pretty much blind. Said, "Then go to Shiloh. Ahijah the prophet is there, the one who told me I would be king over this people. Take 10 loaves of bread with you, some cakes, and a jar of honey, and go to him. He will tell you what will happen to the boy." And we don't really know what Jeroboam is thinking in all this, but he certainly is telling the truth there, although he may not know as much as the prophet knows, and he certainly didn't know how much he was telling the truth here. So Jeroboam's wife did what he said and went to Ahijah's house in Shiloh. Now Ahijah could not see. His sight was gone because of his age. Or if he was not totally blind, he was, near being blind. But the Lord had told Ahijah, "Jeroboam's wife is coming to ask you about her son, for he is ill. And you are to give her such and such an answer. When she arrives, she will pretend to be someone else." Now, of course, she can pretend not only in what she wears. And then some people might say, well, what would it matter what she wore? The prophet's blind. Well, we would answer that with 2 things. Number 1, he may not have been totally blind. And number 2, he probably had some servants before him who would have reported that this is the king's wife to the blind prophet if she had just come in her normal dress. And then, of course, secondly, she can disguise her voice, disguise her actions, her attitudes, disguise her purpose, and so forth. So we've got many different things working under the surface here. So when Ahijah heard the sound of her footsteps at the door, he said, "Come in, wife of Jeroboam." He doesn't have to have anyone tell him who that is. Disguise or no disguise, blindness or complete sight, God has already spoken to him earlier who this was. Why this pretense? I've been sent to you with bad news. This is what she didn't want, and Jeroboam didn't want. Go tell Jeroboam that this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I raise you up, and right on down the line, verse 12, as for you, go back home. When you set foot in your city, the boy will die. All Israel will mourn for him and bury him. He's the only one belonging to Jeroboam who will be buried, because he's the only one in the house of Jeroboam in whom the Lord, the God of Israel, has found anything good. The sad commentary on Jeroboam's family and his rule. Well, see, disguise doesn't go over very well here. She's obviously trying to trick the prophet and lie to him. So disguise here is used in a different sense than it is in 2 Samuel 14 and 1 Kings 20. Then we have another case in this book, chapter 22, verses 30 through 34. It's allowed of the Christian to hide from his enemies, but not to disguise himself. Chapter 22, verse 30, the king of Israel, who is still Ahab now. He's the same one as back in chapter 20. The king of Israel said to the king of Judah, Jehoshaphat. Now, Jehoshaphat gets in trouble for this later on. I think we have to get over into Chronicles to find the account. Because what is righteous King Jehoshaphat doing teaming up with wicked Ahab? Well, God wrecks some of his ships because he does this. But anyway, Ahab, king of Israel, says to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, I will enter the battle. They're going against Ramoth Gilead up in, it's Transjordan, east of the Sea of Galilee. In disguise. I will enter the battle in disguise, but you wear your royal robes. So the king of Israel disguised himself and went into battle. Now Ahab is very subtle, and Jehoshaphat is not thinking very well. Here we've got two kings, one of them in disguise, the other going with his royal robes into the battle. And who do you think the enemy is going to come after but the one in royal robes? And so Ahab is more or less trying to save his own skin and sacrifice the king of the southern kingdom. And he's doing this by disguise. And we have one of the most interesting verses in Scripture that is so powerful for studies in theology later, as you'll see. Now, the king of Aram had ordered his 32 chariot commanders, do not fight with anyone, small or great, except the king of Israel. And so when the chariot commanders saw Jehoshaphat, who's not king of Israel, he's king of Judah, but he's got royal robes on, well, they naturally thought to themselves, surely this is the king of Israel. And so they turned to attack him. But Jehoshaphat cries out. I don't know what he said, but he hollered for his life. And the chariot commanders saw that he was not the king of Israel, and they stopped pursuing him. And look at this verse. But someone drew his bow at random and hit the king of Israel between the sections of his armor. It's a powerful verse for theology of how God can direct everything from the movement of a cloud to the fall of a nation here. That the era just drew at random. They didn't even know which man was the king of Israel out there. He's disguised. He's wearing armor, and the era actually found that little tiny crack in between pieces of the armor, and of course struck him with a fatal blow. The king told his chariot driver, see, God just overthrew all the plans of wicked Ahab here to fulfill the prophecy given earlier in chapter 20, remember. You've given a man's life, now it'll be your life for his life and your people for his. The king told his chariot driver, wheel around and get me out of the fighting, I've been wounded. All day long the battle raged, and the king was propped up in his chariot facing the Arameans. And the blood from his wound ran into the floor of the chariot, and that evening he died. And as the sun was setting, a cry spread through the army, every man to his town, everyone to his land. Israel didn't do so well in this battle. And so we're also going to get the fulfillment of another prophecy spoken by Elisha. The king died and was brought to Samaria, and they buried him there, and they washed the chariot at a pool in Samaria. And the dogs licked up his blood, as the word of the Lord had declared. See, there's God's commentary on disguise, that disguise is not allowed. God sees right through that, and if he so desires, he'll direct the enemy to see right through that, even when they see through that unknowingly. In 1 Samuel 28, we have our third example of disguise. See, I knew we were going to get around to this, to deal with it in a little more detail by looking at these passages. But as you well know, we've already given what we feel is the answer earlier. 1 Samuel 28, verses 7 through around 20. There are about 6 good cases of disguise here. 4 of them are evil, 2 of them are good, but that's because the 4 and 2 fit in 2 entirely different categories. Saul said to his attendants, "Find me a woman who is a medium, that I may go and inquire of her." "There's one in Endor," they said. So Saul disguised himself. Have you ever noticed that the context of all of these disguises is always evil? Putting on other clothes, and at night he and 2 men went to the woman. "Consult a spirit for me," he said, "and bring up for me the one I name." Now this text here just reeks with problems of interpretation, but let's just see it in the sense of our studies this morning. The woman said to him, "Surely you know what Saul has done. He's cut off the mediums and spiritists from the land. And why have you set a trap for my life to bring about my death?" And Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As surely as the Lord lives, you will not be punished for this." Then the woman asked, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" The answer, "Samuel." When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." The king said to her, "Don't be afraid. What do you see?" The woman said, "I see a spirit coming up out of the ground." "What does he look like?" he asked. "An old man wearing a robe is coming up." Then Saul knew it was Samuel and bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. And Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" "I am in great distress," Saul said. "The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has turned away from me. No longer answers me either by prophets or by dreams, so I've called on you to tell me what to do." Now there's the wicked degeneracy of Saul. Look at his reasoning. God's turned away from him, so what good is any man going to do for him then? He's so wicked in his thoughts he can't even see the inconsistency, the lack of logic in his thinking. Samuel is God's prophet, so Samuel and God are on the same side. So if God turns away from you, then so has Samuel. Samuel is certainly not going to predict something good as the outcome for this man. Samuel said, "Why do you consult me now that the Lord has turned away from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done what he predicted through me. He has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David. Because you did not obey the Lord," chapters 13 and 15 of this book, "to carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites, the Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will hand over both Israel and you to the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me," that is, in death. "The Lord will also hand over the army of Israel to the Philistines." Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground, filled with fear because of Samuel's words. His strength was gone. He had eaten nothing all that day and night. All right, and then if you turn with me over to chapter 31. In verse 3, the fight on the mountains of Gilboa. It grew fierce around Saul. The archers overtook him and wounded him critically. And Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw out your sword and run me through, lest these uncircumcised fellows come and run me through and abuse me." But his armor-bearer was terrified and would not do it, so Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor-bearer and all his men died together that same day. And of course, you know the Philistines come, verse 9, and lop off his head. Well, disguise didn't go very well with Saul either. And then finally, in 2 Chronicles chapter 35, verses 20 through 23, we have our fourth or sixth, depending on how you count them, and final reference. The important occasions of disguise in Scripture. 2 Chronicles 35, 20 to 23. Now here, find it happens to someone that's good, Josiah, but he still ends up a dead man because of it. After all this, when Josiah had set the temple in order, Necho, king of Egypt, went up to fight at Carchemish on the Euphrates. Josiah marched out to meet him in battle. Now, this is toward the very end of the 7th century, around 605 B.C., when Nebuchadnezzar, who's controlling and marching with the armies of the Babylonians, is being challenged, and he shouldn't have been, but he's being challenged by Pharaoh Necho of Egypt, the Battle of Carchemish upon the Euphrates. But Necho sent messengers to him, Josiah, saying, "What quarrel is there between you and me, O king of Judah? It is not you I am attacking at this time, but the house with which I am at war, Babylon. God has told me to hurry, so stop opposing God who is with me, or he will destroy you." Josiah, however, would not turn away from him, but disguised himself to engage in battle. He would not listen to what Necho had said at God's command, but went to fight with him on the plain of Megiddo. And archers shot King Josiah, similar to Ahab in 1 Kings 22, and he told his officers, "Take me away, I'm badly wounded." So they took him out of his chariot and put him in the other chariot that he had and brought him to Jerusalem, where he died. He was buried in the tombs of his fathers, and all Judah and Jerusalem mourned for him. So, to get in the context again, 1 Kings 20, 35 to 43, we have seen a case of disguise used by a prophet of the Lord. Such drastic action was to visually and thus more powerfully illustrate a point. However, if statistics alone mean anything, it is interesting to see the general negative outcome of the 4 other biblical cases of disguise, the 4 that I've just provided for you. Jesus occasionally had to hide. The Apostle Paul once fled down the wall in a basket, but I could picture neither of them with a false beard, mustache, wig, clothing, or whatever. So I couldn't picture them doing that. I can picture them hiding. I can picture them fleeing for their life. But I just couldn't picture Paul with a disguise, makeup, and a false hairdo and false clothes to try to get away from someone. I just can't picture that. And I think because that would be out of line with the general presentation of disguise in the Old Testament as we see these references. Okay, is that all understood? No questions on that thus far? Well, let's jump over to B then. B is the same. I think B maybe is a little better known, though. Dramatic forms of writing and speaking. Dramatic forms of writing and speaking. Dramatic, peculiar, whatever you want to call them, or dramatic and peculiar, or dramatic or peculiar. Here's what I have in my paper. Various forms of the printed and spoken word must also be taken into account as exemptions from falsehood. Various forms of the printed and spoken word must also be taken into account as exemptions from falsehood. For example, in irony, an untruthful remark is made, but with the knowledge that both speaker and hearer understand it as irony. Let's look at some examples before we go on. 1 Kings 18:27. First Kings 18:27. In irony, an untruthful remark is made, but with the knowledge that both speaker and hearer understand it as irony. even the hearer doesn't really even have to understand it, I might add, as we'll see later. He doesn't really have to understand it as irony, and it still would not be classified with a lie. 1 Kings 18:27, at noon Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. These pagans crying out for their God, surely he's a God. Well, now, did Elijah lie when he said that this thing that does not exist does exist? Well, no, it's just an ironic statement that he's making here. Perhaps he's deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened. And you see, you might think right away, well, of course, I would never see that as a lie. But people who have the hyper view about truthfulness, if you have the hyper view, you've got to be faithful to your view. And you've got to carry that to its logical conclusion, which will be nothing like this could ever be said or done. People who I've found who have the hyper view really don't have the hyper view. They really don't have that because they don't practice that in their life. And they would allow for something like this to happen. So our fault with them is that they just don't have a good, detailed enough, proper understanding of what truthfulness and lying are all about. Because although we would know that something like this would be exempt, we might not be able to explain where or how it would be exempt. And that's why the Lord gave me these 4 points that we've been giving you, and this being the third up here, so that we can know where to put certain things, how to classify it, to know whether or not a lie is actually being spoken.
Praise God.
Then in chapter 22 and verse 15, 1 Kings 22:15. Now we've read verses 30 onward about Ahab. Ahab and Jehoshaphat together now, and they want a prophet, or Jehoshaphat wants a prophet to tell them what to do. Not these false ones. He wants a true one. Ahab's complaint is, well, I don't want to call this one true one. The only true one I know in Israel today is Micaiah, the son of Imlah, because he always prophesies evil against me.
For the continuation of
He always prophesies evil against me. And Jehoshaphat says, nonsense, don't say that. Call him anyway. And so he does. When he arrived, the king asked him, Micaiah, shall we go to war against Ramoth-Gilead, or shall I refrain? Now, we just saw what happened at Ramoth-Gilead. The king is killed and they lose the battle. Here's Micaiah's response. Attack and be victorious. He answered, for the Lord will give it into the king's hand. Well, he's just mocking the king here, obviously. You'd have to understand that from reading the end of the chapter that the Lord didn't give it. You'd either understand that, or you'd say that the prophet lied, or that you'd say the prophet was somehow mistaken here. Micaiah is not a liar. The king throws him in prison, says, I'll see him when I come back. Micaiah says, if you come back at all, the Lord hasn't spoken by me. Micaiah knows what's going to happen to the king. He's going to die, and Israel's going to lose this battle. But this is spoken in irony and mockery of the king. Attack and be victorious. He probably said it with a grin on his face, a mischievous one at that. The Lord will surely give it into the king's hand. He's not lying. This is a certain peculiar dramatic form of speaking that's known as irony. Okay, back to the paper. The parables of the Bible are meant to be illustrative and not necessarily always literally true. Let's look at a good example here. 2 Samuel 12, 1-6. 2 Samuel 12, 1-6. You'll see a mixing together of the acting and the speaking. They really do go together. The parables of the Bible. Now you see, you have to know this to interpret parables. And everyone pretty much already knows this, but they don't know how to classify these things with regard to lying and telling the truth. The parables of the Bible are meant to be illustrative and not necessarily always literally true. In other words, there is a sense in which they cannot be taken at face value. They are to illustrate a point, and the details of the story may be as false as the summer day is long. The Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, he's going to tell a parable. There were 2 men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb that he had for himself, and he raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food and drank from his cup and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity." And then Nathan drops the bombshell, "Thou art the man." Now what if Nathan would have come to David and started rebuking him for his adulterous relationship with Bathsheba? Well, the king might have heard a little bit of that and then thrown him out. This way, you can get the king to hear the whole story. The story, of course, is about Bathsheba. David has many wives. Now, that's a problem, of course, according to the Old Testament, but still, the point is he has many wives. Why go steal Uriah's wife? He's just a common soldier. He's a Hittite at that, a proselyte into Israel's faith. He's got a beautiful wife, Bathsheba. That's the only wife that he has. Why go steal his one little ewe lamb that he has when you have a whole flock of women around here? You see, he had to get to the point of the story, and if he would not have used a parable like this, David probably would have thrown him out. So he concocts this little story. Now, the story is not meant to be literally true. It could have happened, could not have happened, but it's not meant to be literally true. That Nathan actually knew of a case exactly like this of a rich man and a poor man. Now, some people who are hyper on this truthful side would have to argue that Nathan is talking about a real story here, that Nathan was privy to it and its information. And so he just so happens to use that then to the king. And he's not telling a lie because this actually happened, and he wants to, prove a point, illustrate this before the king. But we don't have to go that far. We don't have to assume in this context that this story is literally true, that it ever took place. And that's best to not assume that it's literally true or ever took place. It's best to assume that it's a parable that was dreamed up by Nathan, or perhaps even given to him by the Lord. Remember, he's God's prophet, so that the point could be more powerfully made by illustration. Another example would be, and I'm just going to term this, the parables of Jesus. We don't have to look at individual ones. We know how many of them exist over there. What about all those parables? Jesus said, a certain man did this, or once upon a time this, or the sower went and sowed the seed. Did he actually, that did happen in Palestine, but is he telling the truth based on one man called sower that went and did something, or is he illustrating a point? Sometimes there may be a historical truth behind the parable, sometimes not. What about this case in Luke chapter 10 of the Samaritan and the Levite? Did that ever happen? Maybe not. But the story is still true according to its meaning, not according to its literal historical details, but according to its meaning. There are Levites, there are priests who have been brought up with the law and who simply fail to practice it with regard to love. And there are people like Samaritans who, although they were not brought up with law, as were the Jewish leaders, yet they practice the teaching of love. There's been much debate over the parable of the mustard seed. What did Jesus say whenever he gave that parable? He said, behold, the mustard seed, it is Matthew chapter 13, it is the smallest of all seeds. Well, of course, botanists will jump to that in a hurry and argue against that. That the orchid seed is actually smaller than the mustard seed. And there are others that appear to be smaller. Now, it is proverbially small, the mustard seed, but it's not the smallest. Well, what did Jesus say? It is the smallest of all seeds. But he told that in a parable. The parable of the kingdom, the parable of the growth and the expanse of the kingdom in the world. That the kingdom could start with a small beginning and be fruitful and blossom into this huge, well, it was almost a tree, it grew so tall. that birds actually could nest in its branches. Well, are we going to accuse him of lying? Well, no one, of course, would. So what are we going to accuse him of then? Well, telling something that's not true to prove a point. What if he were to say that the mustard seed is about the fourth smallest of seeds, and then he wants to give the parable? Well, then that just kind of ruins the whole business of the growth from something tiny, 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 tiny into something very, very big. You know, if you say that it's the fourth or the ninth of the small seeds, that just ruins. You'd have to start over again. You'd have to invent a new parable then. You'd have to find something else. If you say, well, why didn't he talk about the orchid? Well, they probably weren't familiar with the orchid. They didn't have the orchid seed. But they were all in Palestine familiar with the mustard seed. What about the case in, I'm just giving you a few of these. It's in all of his parables. And no one would ever accuse him of duplicity in the parables. We would all think that you could tell a false story if you're trying to illustrate a point. What about in Luke chapter 16? Lazarus. The poor beggar Lazarus at the gate under the table of the rich man. And all he got were some of the crumbs that fell from his table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. Well, was there a certain man named Lazarus that Jesus knew? This isn't the same Lazarus now as the one that got raised, because that one got raised. And he wasn't poor. He and Mary and Martha were all rich. Over in John's Gospel, this is back in Luke's. Did Jesus actually know a man named Lazarus? Probably not. He could have. There's always a possibility he could have, but probably not. But what a beautiful story to show the contrast of how people are treated in this world with how they're going to be treated in the next world. In other words, that there is such a contrast, there's no comparison. You can't base how you're being treated now in this world with what it's going to be like in the next world. And see what a comfort that has been for Christians and saints down through history, to know that we could be those Lazaruses around. Nothing to eat but crumbs from these rich people's tables, and the dogs come and lick our sores. But what happens whenever we die? The angels come and carry us home. And whenever the rich man dies, he's buried. And then the next sentence, and when he was in Hades, he opened his eyes and said, oh, if you could just send Lazarus over here and give me, just to quench my tongue with a drop of water. And oh, Jesus said, well, that'd be impossible. There's an impassable gulf that separates Lazarus from you. Well then, now he's really getting non-selfish. Then send someone back to my 5 brothers that I have back on the earth. And Jesus said, oh, that's impossible too. Because if they don't believe the law and the prophets, they won't believe if someone rose from the dead. Amen. Luke 16. Now, Christians, there's much theology in that, and there's much practical comfort and hope in that parable. Right. That parable is probably, if we want to put the word in quotation marks, a lie, if you understand what I mean by that. It never happened. But we're allowed to use things like that to prove a point. Truth, and therefore, to go back to that 1 Kings 20, whenever the man told a lie there that he was in a battle and a captive was delivered to him, well, that never happened, but it was told to prove a point. Truth requires only that one understand such things as they really are. Irony as irony. I-R-O-N-Y. We have all of this in the Bible. Hyperbole as hyperbole. Metaphors as metaphors. Similes as similes. You know, some of these parables are actually similes. Similes are as and like things. The kingdom of heaven is like. That's a simile. The kingdom of heaven is like unto, and he tells us what it's like unto. A metaphor. Jesus said, I am the shepherd. You are the sheep. Well, he's not a shepherd, and we aren't sheep. I am the door. Well, he's not a door. I am the lion of the tribe of Judah. He's not a lion. He's a god. He's not a lion. Those are all metaphors. They're all figures of speech. And you see, again, the conclusion, if you're hyper, you've got to rule all of those things out. And no one in their right mind, even in their wrong mind, ever rules things like that out. That means we believe in total truthfulness. But truthfulness has to be defined correctly. And falling down, as someone might say in one of these areas, is not falling down with regard to truthfulness. Truth requires only that one understands such things as they really are. Irony is irony, hyperbole, figures of speech, metaphors, similes, all of these things that the Bible is just packed full of. You can get a book like Bullinger's book, maybe 1,000 pages there, probably the best that's been written, or one of the best, figures of speech in the Bible. And it goes through hundreds and hundreds and maybe thousands of examples and verses in the Bible of metaphors and similes and figures of speech and what's some of the other things? Synecdoche. Synecdoche is when you put a part for the whole, or you could put a whole for the part. Synecdoche, similes, all types of figures of speech that are used in the Bible that have to be understood as that. If you don't understand them as that, of course you miss the point. We use synecdoches today. What do young people call automobiles? Wheels. Well, that's a synecdoche. You're not really lying. It's really not, you're not going to go getting your wheels out there. You don't own a set of wheels as though that's all that there is. That's a synecdoche, a figure of speech where you put a part for the whole. You call the whole thing by just part of it. It's got wheels on it, so you call it wheels. It's really not wheels, though. But that's occurring in the younger generation. They wouldn't even know they're using a synecdoche, would they? Synecdoche? I just barely got out of the second grade. They're using a synecdoche, though. Or man shall not live by bread alone. That's a synecdoche. What is bread? Food. He doesn't mean bread. He means all different types of food. Bread's a synecdoche as a figure for the whole family. And see, we use that all the time. We use all different types of synecdoches. And there are other technical terms. We'll teach you sometimes. You have to know all that for hermeneutics, how to interpret the Bible. You have to understand how figures of speech are used in the Bible. And figures of speech is a big area. The more you know about that, the better you can interpret some of these things, such as irony and hyperbole, similes, metaphors, synecdoches, and so forth. Okay, let's move on a little bit. Truth is not only linked to words, but also to meanings and purposes. Now, what I mean by that is some people want to bind us in truth to what we say. But truth is more than just words. Truth is meanings and purposes. For instance, words mean different things in different contexts. And so it's impossible to arrive at a mechanical notion of truth. Now that's an important sentence or two there. Now that doesn't mean that you can't arrive at a definition, but the definition explains the spirit of a lie. We've already given you that definition before. Words mean different things in different contexts. And so it's impossible to arrive at a mechanical notion of truth. And of course, I mean by mechanical going just by words only. Because words themselves change meaning, such as in figures of speech. The words change meanings then. And if we're going to go just by the words, of course we could accuse you of duplicity. Because your words, literally speaking, are not true. But your words now take on a new meaning because they're used in a different context. And because of that, it's impossible to arrive at a mechanical notion of truth. Now let me pause here for a moment before I go on. Let me explain a little more about this so you'll know some of the background of this. Remember Joseph Fletcher, Situation Ethics. What Fletcher was always opposed to, he didn't really want to go totally to the libertine side, but he was opposed to legalism. He said all that is mechanics. When God says you can't do this, he doesn't mean always that you can. He means it's best not to, but under certain situations it's okay to. Now that may sound similar to what I'm saying with lying, but of course it's not at all. Because he's saying it's all right sometimes to commit moral wrong, and sometimes it's okay to do moral right. We're never saying that. It's always wrong to lie. There are no exceptions to that. What we're trying to prove is these things that we're giving you are not lies here. It's always wrong to lie. Always wrong. But when you tell your child a little story that's really not totally true to illustrate a point, you're not lying. That's outside of the confines of lying and truthfulness. But we're not saying like Fletcher does whenever I say it's impossible to arrive at a mechanical notion of truth, that means, well, depending on what situation you get in, you can either lie or tell the truth. And whenever you have to lie, really it's not a lie because God counts it as true. No, lying is always wrong. It's always a moral evil. We're just trying to point out that not everything that appears to be a lie, point 3, letters A and B, not everything that appears to be a lie is in fact a lie. That's what I mean by mechanical notion of truth. We can't just go by the literal words. Because truth in words may be deceit in heart. Now, if we've got a neat little mechanical notion, someone could tell truthful words, but intend them to deceive. Well, I think you'd be guilty of lying then. Whether or not you told a lie, that's what you're implying, that's what you mean. Or deceit in words. You can have either one. Truth in words may be deceit in heart. Or deceit in words, such as a hyperbole or a figure of speech. Deceit in words is truth in heart. Truth in words may be deceit in heart. So that would rule out a mechanical notion of truth based on words. They could have told truthful words but been lying in their heart. That is, their intent or purpose. And God would find them culpable for that. Truth in words may be deceit in heart. The reverse is true. Deceit in words, which of course is really not deceit. That's deceit in quotation marks. Jesus said, I am a door. Well, he's not a door. So deceit in quotation marks. Deceit in words is truth in heart. He truly is a door. But by door, we don't mean a big wooden thing, though. Now we mean something different. Now we're using a word, but we're using it in a different context. The word is the same. The word is exactly the same. You could lie about doors in various ways, but here you're not lying about a door, because we're not talking about door that generally is understood under the 4 letters D-O-O-R. We mean something spiritual here, in short, a figure of speech. In this category of writing and speaking, 3 elements always exist. The speaker, the message, the speaker or writer, whatever the case might be, the speaker, the message, the receptor. In other words, we have more than just the message. So to illustrate this for you, if I may. We'll make him happy today. Okay, we've got speaker, we've got the receptor, here's the communication. Now the communication may be lie, and by that we mean metaphor. 3 parts in the communication process. You have someone who communicates, you have what they communicate, you have someone who receives the communication. Apple for the speaker, as it goes through this process of communication, must still mean apple for the hearer, or we immediately have a breakdown in truthfulness, and thereby the social order of man's existence becomes more unlike that which God intended. Or apple for the speaker must mean something else for the receiver along this line of communication, if that's the message truly of this first person. Even though he might use apple, even though he might use door, he might really mean, spiritual entrance. He doesn't mean door, he means spiritual entrance. So he can say door, and as it travels along this line of communication, it comes out as door, but then if it works its way along, it ends up over here as spiritual entrance. In other words, we cannot build a mechanical notion or definition of truth by saying, you got to say this word or that word. Because as long as these 2 people understand, you can lie to me up one side of the room and down the other. As long as I know you're using hyperbole, metaphor, similes, then I know what you mean. I know that you're really not lying to me then. It's lying in quotation marks. Okay, do you understand that then? Yeah. It means all forms, and you see again, you have to strike out a large part of the Bible, because we have to, if we have this mechanical notion, this hyper notion, We'll have to strike out all those parables and those actions and metaphors, all types of figures of speech. And of course, that's impossible to do. One last thing we'll be through this morning. The question of exaggeration. The question of exaggeration. It's a better known word for that less known word, hyperbole. Hyperbole is something that is purposely exaggerated to prove a point. We find many examples of this in the Bible. Hyperbole, Hyperbole, where a fact is intentionally exaggerated, blown out of proportion to prove a point. However, this is an area where you're going to have to be very, very careful. Hyperbole in Scripture is used and is only allowed in the cases where something is trying to be illustrated. But how many times do we use exaggeration and it's just boasting, which amounts to lying then? You can exaggerate and lie, or you can exaggerate and be telling the truth. If it's clearly understood, I might have stood up here and said, when I went down to that meeting, there were 1,000 people there. Well, now you have to tell from the way I'm saying it, there really weren't 1,000 people there. But many ministers will say, there was 1,000 people at the meeting, and they intend for you to believe that. And they're exaggerating. There was only 472 there at that meeting, and they're going to be guilty of lying. You have to be able to determine, and of course I have to be saying it in the right way, that my exaggeration of something is used as hyperbole. I wish I had more time to elaborate on this, because I find in people's lives exaggeration to be one of the chief forms of lying. You just plainly tell more than was really there. That happens, let me tell you, all the time. And that is not allowed. That is clearly sin. If you're telling a story or something to your wife or your husband, you spruce up the details a little bit, they have to understand the details have been spruced up a little bit. It's hyperbole. You're trying to really drive home this point, so you throw in a few extras. Most of the time, though, we don't do it for that reason, do we? No, we get caught in a sticky spot. We want to boast about something we've done. We say, yeah, did you build this? Yeah, I've built, probably a dozen or two of those. And really, it's only 4 that you've done. You see, that's lying then. That's not allowed. Unless there's a smile on your face that, yes, I've been doing this all of my life. And what you mean by that is, no, I just started yesterday. Well, we understand from the way you're saying it that you're not telling a lie, that you haven't been doing it all of your life. But please make a big notation of that. Exaggeration. How much you pray, how much you read, how much you study. That's not hyperbole when someone asks you and you just spout off some figure that's higher than is really true. You are, in fact, lying then. Oh, I wish I had more time. I don't want this to escape your attention. Let me say something else. Mark this down here. If you're going to do anything, try to consciously understate the matter. If you're going to do anything, try to consciously, in other words, if you don't really know what the figure is, consciously put it lower than would be your first guess to make sure that you don't exaggerate. This happens just all the time. We've all been guilty of this, and we need to be aware of this and watch this. Jesus never does this. If he uses exaggeration, it's always for the purpose of hyperbole, to prove a point, and it's understood to be that. There are cases, for instance, Exodus chapter 21, where it talks about a Hebrew slave that if this Hebrew slave of this other Hebrew likes his master and his situation in life there, that you're to bore his ear through and he will be your slave forever. Well, is he going to be his slave in heaven? Well, of course not. Forever just means for a long time. Forever just means as long as you live on this earth, or for a good part of that time. In Genesis, I think it's chapter 49, there was a great famine throughout the Middle East, remember? And Jacob and his descendants are having to go down into Egypt. And what are we told? All of the nations of the world came into Egypt to buy grain. Well, that doesn't mean the North American Indians sailed across the ocean to come over here and buy grain. It's hyperbole, but it's to prove a point, which means many nations in this area. Doesn't mean all, literally all nations. That's mechanically speaking. You would interpret it literally every nation on the face of the earth. That's not true. But too many ministers speak and what they're really doing, and they even call it this as though it's allowed. We've used it jokingly, but it's called evangelistically speaking. Or sometimes it's referred to as ministerial speaking. And what this means is the evangelist who had 200 converts at that crusade comes home and tells everyone there were 800 converts, and he thinks that he's allowed to do that as an evangelist. And they even joke about it. Evangelistically speaking means you're lying. That's just another way for saying lying. Unless you're trying to prove a point and everyone laughs and we know that really 800 people weren't converted there. But I just find this is one of the primary areas for problems in truthfulness, is exaggeration. People ask you, how long did you work? You tack on an extra 30 minutes. You tack on an extra hour. That's just a bull-faced lie. Have you never done that before and been convicted of that? What time did you get up? And you just move it back or move it ahead, whichever you think they want to hear, a half hour or an hour. It's a bull-faced lie. God does not approve of that at all. How much money did you make? How much did you pay for it? Depending on what you think would look best in their eyes, you lower or raise the figure. You do one or the other. Depending, you're afraid of the person. You're trying to impress that person with numbers or figures. And so my advice would be, if you're not for certain, make a conscious effort to put it low. In other words, give what we call a conservative estimate for what was done, or what was said, or what you experienced, or what you saw. Give a conservative estimate. Oh, listen to this. Be sure you remember this. Give a conservative estimate. It's displeasing to God when we exaggerate out of pride, boasting, out of fear of what other people think about us. If you don't remember the figure or the date, you be conservative when you estimate it. Try to hit somewhere underneath that, and God will approve of that. He'll look with favor on your life then. But He's going to cut people off who just habitually lie, and I think to exaggerate is to habitually lie. Make a conservative estimate about something. Where you say, well, then I won't look so good in the eyes of this person because I didn't get as many pages read as I said. Well, what are you worried about looking good in someone else's eyes? That's what causes people to sin, trying to please men instead of pleasing God. We saw fear as being one of the chief problems all along with truthfulness and lies. People are afraid. They get caught in sticky situations and lie because of fear. And we cannot do that as Christians. We shouldn't be out there trying to impress people with numbers or figures anyway. And the true saint is more impressed with that person who in humility understates the issue. I'd be more impressed with that. Because then I had the blessing of finding out later, they said they only did this much. Here's how much they really did. Now what does that do? That gives me a higher view of that person. Well, I'm going to end up with a lower view if I hear them give some figure and I find out later that they way overstated the case. And that the odds are they probably overstated the case knowingly. And you see, there then is the trap of the devil. He's trying to make you appear good, or he's wanting you to think that you want to appear good in someone else's eyes, and down the road it's going to work to your disadvantage. Because if anyone ever finds out that your figures were wrong, you're going to be held in contempt. Where the reverse would be true, if someone finds out your figures were too low, then they're impressed later on because you didn't blow off a lot of steam that's not necessary.